Actually, that's not what I'm going to talk about. I just wanted to get your undivided attention. So, onward. Like so much of the world's unnecessary verbiage, this book was an accidental byproduct. My idea of success was to do for a living what I have done for pleasure, if I'd been independently wealthy. Since I was one of those oddballs who loved classical music, I ended up providing sound projection for avant-garde musicians, from soloists to symphony orchestras. My concert tours sent me all over Europe in a VW transporter full of sound equipment. The evidence of my travels gradually accumulated on the rear door. So long as I arrived at the right place at the right time, I could plan the journey so as to drive slowly through the most beautiful scenery, eat at the best restaurants, and stock up at the most interesting wineries. Finally, at the end of the day, I would relax over dinner in a small hotel or B&B with local food and wine ad lib. In fact, I often felt like the little black boy in Philip Roth's Goodbye Columbus, when the librarian finds him sitting on the floor turning the pages of an art book full of Gauguin's Tahitian natives. He looks up and shakes his head and exclaims, "Man, ain't it the life." 15 years ago, with an impending concert in the north of France, I decided to preface it with a 10-day tour to the south coast and back up to Évreux, where it was to take place. It would be an opportunity to join up with my oldest friend, Frank, for a pilgrimage that we'd talked about for years. Hello, Frank. Are you watching this on YouTube? This presentation is dedicated to you. Over the decades, we'd met up for sightseeing, concert going, and conversation. Frank had been urging me to find time for us to tour France together, and finally, in 1996, it was going to happen. We would sleep in the van, where I laid out a couple of bedrolls, breakfast on muesli and cafetiere coffee, and prepared over a little gas cooker, lunch on picnics garnered from boulangerie and fromagerie along the way, and then settle down in the evening at an auberge specializing in the local cuisine. The plan was for us to go down the western border of France to Nice by way of Longuyon, the Massif des Chartreux and Colmar on the way, and then across the south through the Camargue. I'd always wanted to experience that quintessentially seacoast area, which echoes the ambience of Cape Cod, where I grew up. Then up through the Massif Central, along the Gorge du Tarn, and into the Auvergne, an area I'd known from college days by way of Cantelou's wonderful Songs of the Auvergne, which is the music that we're listening to right now. Then, finally, after the concert, we'd skirt the Brittany coast and back to Boulogne and across the channel to Dover. Mary drew the map, which also includes a trip that we made later in to the Ile de Ré, but that's another story. And so, after what now seems like a lifetime, in fact it was only 15 years ago, I wrote this little travel book. But it didn't start as a book. When I returned, I started writing it up daily in a series of emails to 100 far-flung correspondents. Of course, there were no iPhones in those distant dark ages, so I couldn't have sent it out as we went along. So, when I'd finished, what was I to do with it? Weblogs didn't exist back then, so there was no way of preserving it online, only between covers. I got a lot of encouragement. There was a general consensus among my readers that I should see it into hard copy, as they say. I hadn't the foggiest idea how to go about it, but Tony Rudolph, the brother of a neighbor, was a distinguished author and a small press publisher. And in the course of a single afternoon, over a bottle of wine, a bit of cheese, he taught me everything that I needed to know about preparing printed, camera-ready copy. That was the way it was done in those prehistoric days. He also introduced me to his printer in Oxford and to his distributors for both England and America. I was set up for instant success. I knew exactly what I wanted in the way of book design and illustrations. Again, fortune was on my side. Mary and I were then running the HGS Gourmet Society, and one of our members was Martin Sandhill, a gifted cartoonist and graphic designer whose work had just the look that I wanted. I gave him a description of the dozen or so cartoons I had imagined and the photos to show context, and he came up with a portfolio so close to my conception that he might have dug them out of my brain. Some of them tell stories in themselves. This was us trying to get service unsuccessfully. And this was an awful collection of modern sculpture, which is another story in itself. So, in order for the book to be more than a mere travelogue, there needed to be a story as well as an itinerary. And to be interesting, the story needs an element of conflict. Alas, this didn't prove too difficult to find. Frank and I had sat around for decades listening to music and chewing the fat, but we had never had to live for days at a time out of each other's pockets. And so, setting out in search of France, we also discovered more about each other and ourselves than we wanted to know. And we became a sort of odd couple like Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, with our personal peculiarities sometimes wreaking havoc with our itinerary and our diet. For instance, on more than one occasion, I went in search of a gastronomic pig-out, while Frank stayed in the hotel room dining on the picnic lunch and leftovers. But it was by no means all conflict. Along the way, we joyfully absorbed a plethora of paintings, a diorama of scenery, a cornucopia of comestibles, and an inundation of wine. My plan was to follow my usual N43 route from Calais towards Metz and Strasbourg, with a side trip into the Ardennes forest in Belgium along the Semois. The latter is, in Michelinese, worth a detour. As you approach Frans, the road suddenly comes out at the edge of a cliff, overlooking a vast horseshoe bend in the river, a sight to send the easily distracted driver straight into an oncoming truck. It would be a suitable subject, in fact, for one of those highly detailed late medieval Belgian landscapes by Bruegel or Bosch, in which they seem to be afraid that they might leave something out. By the time we arrived in the late afternoon, the sun has lent the landscape a roseate flush, and the great horseshoe bend of the river is highlighted with touches of gold. The trees with their brilliant fall colors look as though they might have been transplanted from Vermont in a vintage year. Like dutiful tourists, we snapped each other in situ, and then gazed together at the memorable panorama. One of my primary purposes of trips through France has always been to eat at the Hotel Lorraine in Longuyon, a dying town on the edge of Luxembourg. Gerard Tisserand, the proprietor and chef, ordered and still offers an improvised 7-course sampling menu based on what the market offers up that morning. Monsieur Tisserand, whose family started the Hotel Lorraine, to which the Lamas is attached, was able to build its clientele through the trade that came from the iron industry. And then the bottom fell out of coal, steel, and the whole complex that was the region's livelihood. The result was that he had to rely on those who were prepared to make the journey just to sample his cuisine. During the off-season, he brings in customers and staves off boredom by scheduling weekends in which music and food complement each other. A fixed menu degustation is offered on an occasional Friday and Saturday night, each accompanied by live music, which may be classical, folk, or cabaret. The most memorable meal I ate there was in 1961, when one of my stopovers happened to coincide with a Saturday night dinner with music provided by a wind ensemble from the conservatory at Nancy. Between courses, we were treated to stunningly idiomatic performances of modern French composers, including Poulenc, Milhaud, and Satie. And we're listening at the moment to a movement from the Poulenc Sextet, which was one of the works that they performed. Everyone stopped talking and listened. I felt that I was a privileged participant in a total event in which concert and cuisine flowed seamlessly into one another. I was so inspired that after dinner I called my old friend and professor, Eric Mottram, in London to share it with him. Thenceforth, I was the Epicurean who had phoned from France in the middle of the night to anatomize a meal. Our first major artistic destination was to be Colmar, which contains the Eisenheim altarpiece by Matthias Grunewald. It's one of the most richly reverberant works of art in Western Europe. Originally a huge wooden structure with hinged panels that could fold out to reveal different scenes, it was taken apart during the French Revolution, as now shown as separate paintings. It's a masterpiece which has multiple associations, not only with Grunewald's own politically blighted career, but also with composer Paul Hindemith's Sisyphean composition of his great biographical opera, Mathis der Maler. With no hope of a performance, Hindemith nevertheless devoted himself to telling the painter's story in such a way as to prefigure his own future, which was aborted by Hitler's rise to power. Almost 50 years ago, before I even knew the name of Grunewald, I took a modern music course taught by a young Hindemith enthusiast who guided us through the Mathis der Maler symphonic suite, 3 densely constructed movements based on the inner panels of the Eisenheim altarpiece. By the end, I could listen to the Hindemith suite and see the panels in my mind's eye in their entirety. 40 years later, when I stood long before them in Colmar, the Hindemith played itself through in my inner ear. Messiaen's assertion that music showed him colors didn't seem strange. The wooden cross of which Christ is nailed is made of rough, cheap, ugly timbers that have been crudely knocked together. The body of Christ juts forward, his fingers twisted into claws. He's not portrayed as a god, but as a dying man reaching desperately for help that never comes. 2 layers of the wings open up. The first reveals 4 scenes. The left represents the Annunciation, the central panel, the concert of music, a concert of angels. And the music you're listening to is in fact Hindemith's musical realization of that scene. The panel also includes the Nativity, while the right wing shows the Resurrection. With the altarpiece's inner wings open, we see a carved wooden panel with St. Anthony, flanked by a pig, emblem of the Antonine order. This was an important source of income for the Antonines. Guy Guier, who had commissioned the altarpiece, is seen kneeling at the foot of St. Augustine. And here's a better, more 3-dimensional photo of the panel, showing the extraordinary wood carvings by Nicholas Hagenauer. In the left of the 3 inner panels is the visit of St. Anthony to St. Paul the Hermit. The 2 hermits meet in a stunning landscape intended to represent the Theban desert. Grunewald created a fantastic universe surrounding the date palm with a strange mixture of vegetation. The animals in attendance take part, with the crow bringing 2 morsels of bread to the 2 recluses. In this dreamlike scene, the medicinal plants, painted in naturalistic fashion, sprout at the feet of the 2 figures. In the right panel is St. Anthony tormented by demons. Trampled to the ground, beaten with sticks, torn by claws, and bitten, St. Anthony appeals to God for help. And in the lower left corner, the being with webbed feet and a distorted belly seems to personify disease caused by ergot poisoning, resulting in swelling and ulcerous growths. Or maybe it was just too many Big Macs. We've arrived at opening time. Busloads of eager tourists were there before us. By the time we'd found the triptych, a solid phalanx of art lovers was blocking the way. We spent the next few minutes dodging back and forth from panel to panel, avoiding the tourists and their guides. Loudly delivered in multiple languages, their lectures reminded me of the marching bands that converge in Charles Ives' witty orchestral work, The 4th of July. We were to visit 2 more shrines of modern art, the Fondation Mach above St. Paul de Vence and the Picasso Museum in Antibes. The Mach's Museum proves to be a very personal collection. They were astute art dealers in Cannes who gambled heavily on modern artists and won handsomely, both in money and in friendship. Their collection of prime works by Chagall, Matisse, and Miro served as a nucleus for a unique museum which commissioned big out-of-door spaces from Giacometti and from Miro, whose labyrinth is a complete garden of twisted paths and large playful sculptures. Braque and Bonnard were friends, enthusiasts, and contributors. Walking around the gardens, you suddenly encounter Arctidas and Miro's witty fountain, Gargoyle. What will today's Turner Prize winners leave us, other than piles of visual pollution to be disposed of, along with the agrochemicals and the atomic waste? Thus far, we hadn't slept in the van as we intended, but have opted for a hotel room. Tonight, my peaceful slumber after a good meal is interrupted early in the morning by noises off. Opening one eye, I see Frank at the table in the middle of the room with a dim lamp ruffling through a stack of papers. A look at my watch tells me it's 3:30. 3:30 in the morning. I'm not prepared for this. The van's sitting just outside in the enclosed courtyard, its beds ready for occupancy. Muttering something politely incoherent, I put on my dressing gown and stumble outdoors. Inside, the van is very cold, but very quiet. As the sleeping bag warms up, I try to imagine the adjacent one, occupied by an inveterate snorer, as loud and constant as myself, our stentorian battle cries reverberating around the metal shell. Impossible. Our earplugs would be as useless as parasols in a monsoon. There's no getting away from it. It would have to be hotels all the way. After that, after all, it's only money. Later, it's time for embarrassing admissions. Frank had misread his watch, thinking it was 5:30, and my own high-tech international Casio watch had reverted to English summertime. The truth, 4:30 a.m., lay midway between us, but an expensive lesson had been learned. Neither of us would be able to get any sleep, stuffed like 2 Grampuses into a big tin can. Our next stop, the Chateau Grimaldi by the Antibes waterfront, was used as a studio by Picasso just after the war and is now a museum housing many of the works whose genesis it witnessed. By the time it opens, a strong wind has come up. We go through the small front foyer onto the terrace within the battlements and are almost blown away. One sculpture is as strongly dissonant as the wind itself. a random pile of musical instruments cast in bronze. They might have well been producing the sort of sounds that I used to amplify. Near the edge of the wall is a giant arrow pointing down out of the sky, and we take each other's picture posed so that we appear to be what the arrow is pointing at, the center of attention, as always. Childhood is less a product of age than of attitude. The Picasso Museum is given poignancy by the circumstances of its foundation. During the German occupation of France, Picasso made a heroic gesture. When everyone who could was leaving, he refused a ticket, went back to Paris, took a studio on the Rue Saint-Augustin. There he turned out some 400 works whose somber themes and colors reflect their circumstances. Picasso was not a member of the resistance, but he was a high-profile opponent of the Nazis as far back as the Spanish Civil War, when his painting of the destruction of Guernica, this is it, spoke for a generation. Those who knew him in Paris say that his courage, one might also call it arrogance, placed him in constant danger. There's a resonating anecdote. A Nazi officer who prided himself on his sophistication came to inspect Picasso's studio, and seeing a reproduction of Guernica, asked wryly, "Oh, did you do that?" "No," replied Picasso, "you did." The Chateau Grimaldi was made into a museum in 1928. After the war, when Picasso left Paris and came to live in the area, the museum's curator invited him to use part of it as a studio. Picasso's relief at the war's end is obvious in the works he created there, many of which are light-hearted variations on classical mythology. A blue and yellow fantasy of prancing satyrs is entitled Le Joie de Vivre. Today, we see his extraordinarily inventive use of junk as a deliberate mark of his originality and nonconformity. We forget that conventional artists' and sculptors' materials had become extremely scarce. He worked with what he had, don't we all? After a rainy day's driving, we arrive in a market square on the edge of Arles. Just across the street, next to an Arab bar, there's a hostelry, straight out of a Pagnol film. "Savoy Hotel," proclaims a rickety sign. Yeah, sure, and I'm driving a Daimler. A hefty motorbike is parked in the small front lobby. An Arab woman shows us a room with peeling wallpaper and flaking paint. I venture to turn back the bedclothes, and the sheets are clean. There's no marathon race of cockroaches to the bed's inner resources. The price, 140 francs, is not far from what we might expect at the YMCA. What the hell, it's an adventure. On the swings and the roundabouts, an El Cheapo room like this opens up the possibility of a rather splendid restaurant. I go on a quick shouting expedition and discover that we're just on the edge of the old city with a wide range of costs and cuisines. Reporting back to Frank, I find him munching on bread and cheese from the lunchbox. He's decided on another night's hibernation. Okay then, I'm on the town. The sky's the limit. The rain has let up enough for me to close my umbrella and enjoy the misty drizzle. I stroll along, idly looking at the displayed menus. Many seem acceptable, but none are compelling. Then, across the street, there emerges a Hollywood set of a hotel, a monumental entrance with a pillared porch, flanked on one side by an imposing chapel with a stuck-on Grecian facade, and on the other, an enormous restaurant glowing with crystal chandeliers. It could be the vestigial remnant of a monastery. Close. It turns out to be a 17th century Carmelite convent, converted in 1929, just in time for the Wall Street crash, converted into the Hotel Jules César. The menu of the Le Marquet restaurant announces that it is a member of the Auguste Relais et Chateau chain, which includes such gastronomic shrines as Robichon in Paris and the Hotel de France in Auch. It takes only a moment to decide on an experiment. The way I'm dressed, I look like Santa in mufti. Floppy beret, shapeless cotton slacks, turtleneck shirt, and a fisherman's smock. In fact, I'm dressed very much the way I am at this very moment. I stroll up to the imposing front entrance and talk to the young maitre d' who's taking the reservations. Bonjour, when is the restaurant open? Bonjour, monsieur, 7:30. Do you have a table for one? Oui, monsieur. What's your name, please? The details are exchanged without a single haughty glance at my clothes, my somewhat straggly beard, or my floppy hat. Then, I'm off for a half-hour's walk. When I return at 7:30, the maitre d' greets me immediately by name without glancing at the reservation book. As he takes me to my table, I apologize for being inappropriately dressed and explain that when I set out, I had no intention of eating so grandly. If he would prefer to hide me away at a little table in the corner, not at all, monsieur. He leads me to a table immediately next to the entrance where I can see and be seen by everyone who comes in. I choose the menu de terroir at 300 francs, 5 courses, local specialties, and a bottle of Domaine Tempier Bandol Rosé. I'm then free to turn my attention to the evening guests. Most of the room seems to be booked for a large party of Americans on a grand tour. They're all clamoring for attention and shouting across from table to table. If you get a waiter, hang on to him, don't let him get away. They're all ordering a la carte, demanding translations, deciding with difficulty, and then changing their minds. In the midst of all this confusion, my courses start arriving at just exactly the right intervals and the right temperatures. My wine is replenished from the chilled bottle as soon as I'm within an inch of the bottom. The young waiter is dignified but affable, stopping for brief exchanges with such unhurried poise that the restaurant might have been empty. Halfway through the meal, he asks politely as he tops up my glass, "Is the restaurant too noisy for you?" I can't help laughing. That's the wittiest thing a waiter ever said to me. He smiles at our little joke and turns to the next table where a tipsy American is loudly demanding attention. It's been a thoroughly enjoyable meal, but in a few days, I won't easily remember what I ate. Everything was perfect, nothing was surprising. It was as ambiguous as a speech by a great statesman on a grand occasion. When you're serving a clientele such as this, who are paying this kind of money, you don't mess around with the lemongrass and the foie gras. So, am I disappointed? Not in the least. I've eaten an expertly prepared dinner and witnessed a great performance. At the end of the meal, I'm invited to have coffee in the lounge, where, for 20 francs, there's a small cafetiere of superlative coffee and a lifetime supply of delicious petit four. If I had appeared in evening dress wearing the Légion d'honneur, I could not have been entertained more graciously, which is exactly what I tell the maitre d'. I've always wanted to visit the Camargue. I associate it with Cape Cod, where I grew up, and also with Bizet's incidental music for Daudet's sad tale, L'Arlésienne, the girl from Arles, which we're listening to at the moment. My plan was to head southwest from Arles to the ancient fortress town of Aigues-Mortes. But at one point we detoured a few kilometers to Saint-Marie-de-la-Mer. This intriguing name commemorates the miraculously safe, legendary landing of the 3 Marys and Martha after having been cast adrift in a boat. For me, seacoast towns all have the same feel. You could take me blindfolded to any small village in the Western Hemisphere and I would know if I was close to water as soon as I opened my eyes. Saint Marie has a central square whose squat white public buildings would be at home among the old adobe structures of Monterey, California. At their front is a rectangle of small streets with modest shops and a couple of ancient churches laid out in a grid pattern, which is so common in flat country. Several little grocery stores are open, and juggling my shopping bag, my wallet, and my dripping umbrella, I'm able to replenish our supplies. On the way back to the van, the Tex-Mex illusion is complete. There's a shop and then another selling Western outfits, embossed boots, embroidered shirts, 10-gallon hats, and all the paraphernalia of the rodeo. There are the international sales gimmick for the Camargue cowboys who tame the wild white horses to herd the black cattle which supply the bulls for the arenas. Agribusiness as well as tourism is invading this vast wildlife sanctuary. Since World War II, half the wetlands have been placed under cultivation, and the huge nature reserves which should protect them consist only of private property with no state control of their use or abuse. I suddenly realized why so much of the land we're driving through looks like rice paddies. That's exactly what they are. Driving to Aigburth through the irrigated farmland, we might as well be here in the Sacramento Valley. The Camargue, one of the last outposts of coastal wilderness, is being carved up and capitalized. The flat marshlands are ideal for controlled flooding. Those misnamed dead waters are being claimed by agricultural conglomerates that are killing the wildlife which the salt marshes have already supported. Rising up out of nowhere on this rainy afternoon, the prospect of Aigburth is unreal. I can imagine what it must have been like half a millennium ago when, approaching it on a clear day by land or sea, it appeared to rise gradually above the Earth's curvature like a fleet of vessels coming into port. Before the silting up of the Rhone's mouth, the town was itself a major port. Its founder, Louis IX, set out from there on the Seventh Crusade. Contemporary paintings show how high the city walls must have seemed to rise above the sea and the countryside. Within the ramparts, still intact, is a miraculous square mile of medieval houses and a chapel built in the late 17th century for the Grey Penitents. The town's single, open, tree-lined square is now surrounded with cafes, of course, except at one side where stands a church even older than the 13th century town itself. Its name, Notre Dame de Sablon, Our Lady of the Sands, vividly conjures up what must have been its surreal isolation. As usual, the side streets, and here, that is most of the town, are empty of tourists. We walk to one of the outer walls where a gate, locked and wire fenced, shows an endless vista of sand and silt. But just outside is this large circle of what seem to be enormous pieces of furniture, like old high-sided church pews of different designs and materials, all of them enclosing benches and seats for up to a dozen occupants. I realized with a shock that it is a do-it-yourself bull ring in which each spectator or patron has cobbled together his own vantage point. Now, unlike Spain, bullfights in the Camargue are traditionally an unequal contest favoring the quadruped. Hardly a fight at all, but a high-risk ballet in which unarmed and unarmored acrobats attempt to snatch a ribbon from the bull's horns. The bulls themselves whose chances of survival at the end are 100%, return triumphantly year after year. If, like Spanish matadors, they were offered the loser's ears, they would be happy to make a meal of them. Unfortunately, the international tourists who now fill the big bull rings find this humanitarian version of the spring boring. And so the bull's lifespan is becoming problematical. We visited lots more interesting places, but you'll have to read the book to find out what they were. By the end of the trip, Frank and I had got on each other's nerves to the point where we cut it short and went back home. Me, back to London, Frank to Chicago. We exchanged vitriolic letters and then lapsed into a sulky silence. Frank had once told me a great joke about a man who gets a flat tire in the middle of Death Valley. He starts to put on the spare and discovers that he's forgotten his jack. Now, way off in the horizon, he sees a gas station and he sets out for it. As the miles go by, he thinks to himself, the guy in that station will have me over a barrel. He'll charge me a fortune to borrow a jack. He'll make me walk all the way back. He'll make me pay a big deposit in case I don't return it, and he'll laugh at me. As he trudges along, he gets more and more furious. Hours later, he arrives at the garage in a towering rage. The owner greets him at the pump. "Hey, mister, you look plumb tuckered out. What can I do for you?" The angry, sweating man hauls off and socks the garage owner in the jaw, knocking him to the ground. Standing over him, he shouts, "I wouldn't take your goddamn jack if it was the last one on earth." One day, I get a phone call. It's Frank calling from Chicago. He begins, "About that jack." We both collapse in helpless laughter. What a silly pair of old codgers we are. The trip of a lifetime, and then 40 years of friendship gurgling down the drain. Returning to our senses, we enthusiastically make arrangements to meet when we're both in Vienna in a couple of weeks. Those who may possibly be interested, Mary, by a strange coincidence, has a whole stack of the books over here on the corner. And she's prepared to talk to anybody who wants to do anything about it.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm sure it raised a lot of memories in a lot of us, didn't it?
Well, it certainly did for me.
I must say, your description of the Camargue now is rather sad, isn't it?
Well, yes, actually. It is.
I was there about 30 years ago. It was wonderful.
Yes, yeah. Well, it is, if it can be bought, it will be bought.
Right. I'm sure there's some questions here. Yes? Dorothea.
The insect life in the Camargue.
Oh God, yes.
I'm sorry?
She said, what about the insect life in the Camargue?
I wasn't small enough to communicate with them. I'm afraid I don't know. But I'm sure it suffered along with everything else.
Yeah, I remember it pretty grim. The mosquitoes.
The insect. Oh, those, yes. Well, we were prejudiced against mosquitoes. I remember back in college, I had to do a biology class, and there was just one thing that amused me in the biology textbook, which was totally without humor, except at one point, talking about malaria, the author explained that malaria survived because of two carriers, the mosquito and the human. And that humans, following their natural bias, had chosen to get rid of the mosquito.
did Frank find annoying about you, John?
Oh, I was a bit sort of bossy, and I sometimes was sort of more wedded to the schedule than what we were doing at the moment might want. But we really were the odd couple situation. We were old friends, we were close friends, but it's just the very fact of living out of each other's pockets. The occasional marriage turns up such marginal incompatibilities.
How long did the excursion take you, actually?
Well, 10 days. We did a lot of driving, but we did a lot of seeing as well. It was for both of us. It was a good balance. Mary doesn't like traveling that much in the course of a holiday and being more settled down, which is a perfectly rational way of doing it. But Frank and I were both, gluttons for scenery and gluttons for art, and we were happy to race along and get in as much as we possibly could along the way. It wasn't quite like that notorious film about American tourists in Europe with the title "Today's Tuesday, so this must be Belgium."
You see, it's funny because you sort of didn't stay in smart hotels and you were prepared to sleep in a car, yet you were willing to blue 300 francs on a gourmet meal.
Well,
I can't quite understand.
Well, it's because when I'm eating, I'm awake. When I'm sleeping, I'm asleep.
Well, you didn't spend all that long time in the car, did you?
We didn't, in fact, end up sleeping in it at all. In fact, we just realized that it was not practical to.
Well, after all that driving, you wanted a bit of comfort, didn't you?
Well,
the end of the day.
We wanted, yeah, we did, but it was also very nice in that where we generally ate where we slept or very close to it, so that there was no question of having to watch our alcoholic intake in order not to to drive off the edge of a cliff somewhere.
Did you both speak French well?
Not in the slightest is the answer. You might even have been able to deduce this from my rather patchy pronunciation of French place names.
What happened in your holidays fortnight later in Vienna then? Did you meet?
That was I was over there. I had a concert with Simon Rattle in the Birmingham Symphony, and he was there independently, and so we just got together. I was working, well, not entirely, and he was there on the holiday. Oh, we had a great time. Yeah, and so we've been together innumerable times since then, and spent a lot of time in Paris together, masses. Oh yeah, we're old buddies.
I must announce my ignorance, I think. You talk about music. Yes. And concerts. What do you play?
I did what is called sound projection, sound design. I controlled the amplification and the treatment of what is called electroacoustic music, in which live sounds are treated by various forms of what's called digital delay devices that alter it. But the person who is responsible for this is as integrally a part of the ensemble as any of the musicians, because I, like the conductor, they have the chance of totally destroying the performance if I don't do it correctly. And sometimes the treatment is quite complex. And I wasn't a performing musician in the sense of twiddly-dum, but I was a principal member of the London Sinfonietta, for instance, and so they acknowledged the importance of the function. But anyway, funny noises have to be done somehow or other.
Yes, very interesting.
We better finish there, have we?
Yeah.
Had we better finish?
Sorry?
Had we better finish?
Yes, it's nearly time. Well, it's been very interesting. Thank you very, very much. I'm sure it's been lots of enjoyment to everybody. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And Mary is here.